The envelope was already on the floor when I returned home that November evening. It rested just inside my apartment door, as though it had slipped in under its own power. No return address, no stamp, just my name in an unnervingly familiar scrawl across the front. I turned it over in my hands. The paper was thick and rough, more parchment than stationery, and the scent of damp earth clung to it. My instincts whispered that it didn't belong here, in my modern, sterile apartment. Still, I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of yellowed paper. The words were jagged and uneven, written with a hand that seemed unsure of its strength. "Come to the Festival of Lanterns in Shallow Hill. It's time you remembered." I frowned, rereading the message. I didn't know any Shallow Hill or a Festival of Lanterns. And what was this about remembering? I had half a mind to crumple the thing and toss it, but something stopped me. A cold unease crept into my chest. That night, sleep evaded me. The words on the paper seemed to burn themselves into the back of my eyelids, appearing every time I closed my eyes. By morning, exhaustion gave way to resolve. I had to know what this was about. The drive was longer than expected. Shallow Hill didn't appear on any maps, and GPS was useless in the winding back roads of the countryside. The trees grew denser the farther I went, their skeletal branches clawing at the overcast sky. By the time I saw the first sign, wooden and rotting, with Shallow Hill, established 1834 scrawled in faded paint, it was nearly evening. The town seemed to materialize out of the mist like a forgotten photograph coming into focus. Narrow streets of cobblestone wove between crooked buildings, their windows darkened by thick curtains. Lanterns hung from poles and tree branches, casting feeble golden light into the encroaching gloom. I parked at what looked like the town's edge and stepped out of my car. A gust of cold wind carried the faint scent of smoke and decay. Somewhere in the distance, the low hum of a melody began, but I couldn't place its source. As I approached the town square, a man appeared, his face pale and gaunt, as though he hadn't slept in years. His eyes were wide and darted nervously, yet he offered me a lantern without a word. "You're just in time for the remembrance," he said finally, his voice trembling with something I couldn't name. The festival was in full swing, or at least, that's what I assumed. Crowds moved sluggishly through the square, their faces shrouded in shadow despite the glow of the lanterns. They wore clothes that seemed decades, if not centuries, out of place. High collars, long skirts, and dark coats. Not a single smile crossed their faces. I wandered aimlessly, clutching the lantern the gaunt man had given me. Its flame flickered in a way that seemed almost alive, the light bending and stretching toward shadows that darted just out of view. "Excuse me," I tried asking a passing woman in a heavy shawl. She turned, and for a moment her eyes glinted red in the lantern's glow. Then she was gone, blending into the crowd without a word. The air felt heavier as the strange melody swelled, emanating from an unseen source. I noticed for the first time the photos lining the shop windows, sepia-toned portraits of grim-faced families and individuals. At first glance, they seemed like standard fare for an old town, but then my stomach knotted. One of the photos bore my face. I blinked, leaning closer to the glass. It was unmistakable. The high cheekbones, the faint scar above my left eyebrow. But this version of me wore clothing I'd never seen before, and the eyes staring back weren't quite mine. Panic clawed at my chest, and I backed away, nearly colliding with an old woman carrying a basket. She hissed at me under her breath, the words unintelligible before disappearing into the crowd. That's when I saw her. She floated down the street, pale and glowing, her face blurred as though smeared by unseen hands. Her dress flowed like mist, and her hair, long and silver, moved unnaturally in the still air. The crowd parted to let her pass, their heads bowed in silent reverence. And then she stopped, her head tilted toward me, though I couldn't make out her features. A strange cold settled in my limbs as she began drifting in my direction, her form solidifying with each step. The lantern in my hand flared suddenly, the flame snapping upward like a living thing. The woman halted, her form wavering as if caught in a gust of wind, before dissolving into the night. The crowd resumed its sluggish movement, but I stood rooted to the spot, my pulse hammering. I needed to leave. But when I turned back toward the direction of my car, the road was gone. The path out of town had been swallowed by dense woods, and the soft hum of the melody had turned into a low, droning chant. The road was gone. My heart hammered as I stumbled back, clutching the lantern like it was a lifeline. Behind me, the low, droning chant swelled, threading through the air like the whispers of unseen watchers. I turned back toward the square, hoping to find someone, anyone, who could explain what was happening. The crowd had thinned. What remained were scattered figures moving like marionettes, their steps stiff and unhurried. The lantern light cast grotesque shadows on their faces, deepening the hollows of their cheeks and sharpening their features into masks of silent despair. "Hey!" I shouted, the sound brittle against the oppressive quiet. No one stopped. No one even looked at me. My attention snapped to a sudden flicker at the edge of my vision. Another figure emerged from the mist, this one darker, heavier. A man with sunken cheeks and hollow eyes, the same who had given me the lantern. He moved toward me with purpose, his expression carved from stone. "You should not have come back," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Back?" I took a step away. I've never been here before. His head tilted, and his lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Haven't you?" I shook my head, the panic rising in my throat. "I don't understand. I don't know this place. I don't know you." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of parchment. He held it out, and when I didn't take it, he slipped it into my pocket with an unsettling familiarity. "You've always been part of this," he said. "The pact demands it." Before I could protest, he turned and melted into the mist. My fingers fumbled for the paper, pulling it out with shaking hands. The writing was old and ornate, the kind you'd find in ancient books. The words sent a chill racing down my spine. "In the shadow of the forgotten, the living must atone. Once in 50 years, the veil shall thin, and the festival shall honor the lost. One must remain, so the balance holds." I didn't want to understand, but the pieces were clicking into place despite my fear. The photos, the whispers, the way the townsfolk avoided my gaze. I wasn't just a visitor. I was connected to this place, this ritual in some way I couldn't remember. The hum of the chant grew louder, tugging at me like a physical force. The lantern in my hand felt heavier, its flame now a deep, smoldering red. And then I saw her again, the pale woman from before. She appeared at the edge of the square, her form sharper now. I could see her face, and it was mine, or almost mine. Her features were a distorted echo, like a reflection in a shattered mirror. She raised her hand, beckoning. I backed away instinctively, my breath catching in my throat. The pale woman didn't walk. She glided toward me, her movements smooth and unnatural, like she was tethered to the air itself. Her eyes locked onto mine, milky and clouded, yet impossibly aware. "Who are you?" I whispered, though I wasn't sure I wanted an answer. Her lips parted, and her voice came like a breeze slipping through dry leaves. "You know me." "I don't," I said, louder now, gripping the lantern as if its feeble glow could protect me. "I don't know anything about this place." Her head tilted slightly, and her expression twisted into something like pity. "You chose to forget, but this night brings it all back. You belong here as I do, as we all do." I shook my head violently, stepping back toward the nearest building. My hand brushed the cold stone wall as I felt for an escape. "No, this isn't real. I don't belong here." "You cannot leave," she said, her voice soft but absolute. "The pact has chosen." I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing on the cobblestone. The lantern's flame flickered wildly, casting disjointed shadows as I darted down an alley and into a narrow street. The chant followed, louder now, as if the very air carried it. The town seemed to shift around me, the streets twisting and narrowing, trapping me in a labyrinth of stone and shadow. Faces appeared in windows as I passed, faces that weren't quite human. Their eyes followed me, unblinking, mouths moving in silent synchrony with the chant. I found myself back in the square, though I couldn't have retraced my steps if I'd tried. The statue in the center loomed above me, cracked and worn, depicting a figure holding a lantern. My lantern. The pale woman stood before it now, joined by others, figures I recognized from the photographs in the shop windows. They stared at me with expressions of expectant sorrow. "Accept your place," she said. "The cycle must continue." "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "There has to be another way." The lantern in my hand grew unbearably hot, the flame leaping higher. My pulse quickened as I made my decision. I didn't know what would happen, but I couldn't let them take me. With all my strength, I hurled the lantern at the base of the statue. It shattered, and the flame erupted in a blinding burst of light. The chant fractured into screams. The figures recoiled, their forms twisting and disintegrating into shadows. The pale woman lunged for me, her mouth opening in a soundless wail as she dissolved into nothingness. The world around me rippled like disturbed water. Then there was silence. When I opened my eyes, the square was empty, the statue reduced to rubble. I stood alone in the eerie stillness, the cold air heavy with finality. But as I turned toward the woods, I caught a faint glimmer in the corner of my eye. A lantern, unbroken, rested on the steps of the ruined statue, its flame burning a soft, familiar red. The shattered silence pressed in on me as I stood frozen before the lantern. It looked pristine, untouched by the chaos that had just unfolded. Its flame flickered softly, a sinister ember against the deepening night. I didn't want to touch it. Every instinct screamed for me to leave it where it lay, to run until the memory of this place was swallowed by distance. But my feet refused to move. The air was too heavy, too thick. It clung to me, whispering with voices that weren't there. I reached down, fingers trembling, and the moment my hand brushed the lantern's cold metal handle, a shock coursed through me. The world shifted. Shadows poured from the corners of the square like liquid smoke, swirling and twisting into shapes. Figures half-formed and agonizingly familiar. Their faces were broken fragments of memory. The gaunt man, the pale woman, and others I didn't recognize but somehow knew. "Did you think it was over?" The voice wasn't hers, yet it carried the same quiet, mournful weight. I stumbled back, clutching the lantern as the shadows coiled closer. They didn't move like people. They rippled and jerked, their edges fraying into the air, and all of them were looking at me. "You broke the balance," the voice continued, 1,000 whispers layered together. "You chose defiance over duty. Now the burden follows you." "No!" My voice cracked as I shouted, my grip tightening on the lantern. "I didn't ask for this. I don't belong here." The shadows paused, the figures flickering like dying flames. One by one, their faces melted into the darkness, leaving only the pale woman. Her blurred visage hovered just inches from mine, the edges of her form dissolving and reforming as though reality itself rejected her. "You will remember," she said, her voice no longer mournful but filled with cold certainty. "Wherever you go, we will find you. The pact is eternal." The lantern's flame flared suddenly, casting an eerie red glow that swallowed the square. The shadow surged forward, enveloping me in a suffocating darkness. I screamed, thrashing as the cold seeped into my bones, and then... silence. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my car, the engine idling on a road cloaked in fog. The clock on the dashboard blinked erratically as if caught in a loop. My breath came in shallow gasps as I looked around. No sign of the town. But the lantern was there. It sat on the passenger seat, its flame a faint, pulsing red. I stared at it, unable to breathe. Somewhere deep in the fog, a familiar melody began to hum, soft but growing louder. The road stretched endlessly before me, but I knew now that it led nowhere. Shallow Hill wasn't a place. It was a part of me, and it would never let go.